This is the first chapter of a story I never thought I'd get to tell, one that involves some of the best fishing I've ever experienced and the capture of what I believe are up there with the finest carp you will ever see. Some of my fondest memories brought back to life by a twist of fate. I remember looking at these carp, I'll never forget this, but I looked down on these fish and I thought to myself, I need to catch as many of these carp as I possibly can. And you need to do all that you can to catch as many of these carp as you possibly can. They were like no other carp I'd seen before. I will always fondly remember being on the top of that bank with that fish, because part of me felt like I didn't deserve to be holding it. Part of me felt like I was never supposed to be holding that fish, but I was. Make the most of your Cypography membership. Click giveaways and win big. Click discounts or tackle shop and save big with 10% off your fishing tackle, bait and clothing. Now, this is a story that for a long time I never thought I would have the privilege to tell, and in some parts of me I never thought I would even get to the point where I had a story to tell. There's all sorts of stuff that happened, twists of fate and that kind of thing, that eventually led me to the point where I had a ticket for the lake I'm about to speak about. And to begin the story, we need to go back to around about 2010, so some 15 years ago as I say this. Now, the lake in question is a relatively little known syndicate, not too far from my house here in Essex, and it was a place, or is a place, that is renowned for having an incredible stock of carp. The fish at the time, so say 2010, the fish at the time had been into the 50-pound barrier. You know, they were big carp back then. They're big carp now. They're really big back then. But not only did this lake have big fish, it had beautiful fish. The stock was said to be quite simply incredible. You know, that was the thing, that was the kind of things that you'd hear. You know, that was the kind of things you heard. I hadn't seen a great deal of the fish. In fact, the place was kept relatively low key. In fact, even to this day, it has remained that way. And it was a syndicate that was run kind of in an old school way. That's how I always looked at it. You know, you've got your modern day syndicates that times change and times move. Time is always moving, and often with it, so do the way that fisheries are run. But this place had kind of kept its old school values, and it was a fishery that, look from the outside looking in, you know, it was one of those dead man's shoes syndicates. But back in 2010, I'm going to say 2010, it was roughly then, a friend of mine, Rob Willingham, who I think at the time also worked at Corder with me. I'd known Rob for years previous, but I think at the time he was also working at Corder. He may not have been. That's how long ago it was, because he's still there to this day. But my friend Rob, he had a ticket for the lake, and at that time I was working at Corder and I worked in the media department. So my job was essentially to create magazine and video content, although the video content back then it may not have even existed, and if it did, it was very minimal, you know. But my job was go out with the sponsored anglers, get the magazine articles and cover that side of Corder's day-to-day media. Rob had fished the lake for a while at this point and had caught several of the lovely carp that resided in there, and I'm not sure if there was a publicity ban at this time. I don't think there was. It would make sense that there wasn't, but if there was, Rob had got permission to do an article, and I went down there to see Rob and to shoot an article for Carp World magazine, which was a classic carp mag, and this story, or his story, would very much fit into that, because like I say, he'd caught some really beautiful, really big carp from the lake. So I went down to the lake, we did that, we did the article, that was later published. But after the publication of that article, things really blew up. Things got, I don't know, a bit messy, I suppose. And I think within Rob's article, don't quote me on this, because we're talking over 15 years ago. But I think in Rob's article, he'd mentioned catching a carp And this carp was over 35 pound. And at the time, there was a rule that said if you catch a carp over 35 pounds, you have to call a bailiff, who will then come down to the lake to help you with the weighing and stuff like that, or photographing and stuff like that. I think Rob hadn't done that. This had come out in the article. He might have pre-baited as well, very lightly or whatever, but there was a couple of things in this article anyway that caused a stir. From memory, Rob was treated quite unfairly over all of this. I think there were a couple of guys on there at the time that, you know, you could say had it in for him. And as much as these rules were in place, you know, I don't think they were particularly well policed or anything like that. You know, Rob is not the sort of person that goes out of his way to cause himself or anyone else any problems. You know, he doesn't go around getting banned from places and all that, but he later did. And because of this article, and off the back of this article, there became a really strict no publicity rule and an anti-publication or media stance. So not only was it no pub, but they didn't want anyone or anything to do with magazines, with filming and anything like that to do with the syndicate. So at that stage, I'm sure my name was on the list, and if it wasn't, it would have gone on the list shortly after, but thinking about it logically, it must have already been on the list. But after that happened with the article, my chances of getting a ticket all of a sudden felt and were very, very slim, because if you were anything like me, you worked for a fishing brand, you were a sponsored angler, you know what I'm saying, anything like that, your name was basically blacklisted and you weren't going to get a ticket, or certainly that was how it was put across anyway. So all of a sudden, I've gone from pure excitement, you know, I've been to the lake now with Rob, I've met a couple of the bailiffs, I've seen the place, I've heard his story, I've seen more of the fish, and I really wanted a ticket. You know, this place is, like I say, it's not far from my house. And at that time, a lot of my fishing was local. I've always tried to fish as many of the local lakes as I can, you know, make the most of what is on your doorstep. This place was creme de la creme. I wasn't going to better this. I wasn't going to find better carp than these, bigger carp than these close to home. So I really wanted a ticket, as did lots of other people. And after that happened, like I say, the chances of that ticket ever coming up felt very, very slim. And in the years that preceded that, I kept in touch. You know, I remember a few times I'd sort of chase the odd person I knew that had a ticket to see what my chances were like. And I remember one year I was out shopping with Jem. We were in a retail park, car park, and I made contact with the syndicate, and I got a message back that essentially, I remember it riled me a little bit. And I nearly replied and said, stick the ticket up your ass. You know, I was a bit pissed off with the fact that I was never going to have a ticket on there simply because of where I worked. Now, if the place is no publicity, you know, I accept that. I've fished many lakes over the years, or certainly a few over the years where that's the case. And if it's no publicity, I won't publicise them. And beyond that, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to fish the lake. That's how I saw it. So I nearly sent this message back and pretty much ended any hope that I would ever have of getting a ticket. But I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because, I don't know, maybe 10 years later, so I've been on the list, yeah, I'd say it was 10 years down the line, I've been on the list that whole time. Although my name was on it, kind of felt like it wasn't, but you know, like I said, I'd stayed in touch. A friend of mine, Michael Scopes, I call him Scopes, so if I say Scopes, that's who I'm referencing. He had a ticket, and Scopes was the guy that I really got into carp fishing with. You know, when we left school at the age of 15, 16, whatever it was, we were fishing 15, 20 night sessions throughout the 6 weeks holiday. We were flat out, full time in it, as kids. We hadn't read Terry Earn's book or anything like that and been inspired by those stories. That came later. We were just two young lads, completely obsessed with carp fishing. And when we left school, all we wanted to do was fish, and that's what we did. You know, like I say, we were fishing club waters. We were there flat out every single day we could be fishing. We would be, and without him, there would be no me, because it was our fishing together that really led me down the road I ended up going down. You know, Scopes, as much as he's still an angler today, his fishing never got as serious as mine. He didn't carry that on, you know. He learned to be a chippy at college, and in the latter years progressed with that, whereas I was full steam ahead with the fishing. I stayed very much in the loop of fishing a lot, doing everything I could to find my way into the industry that I now work in. And like I say, without Scopes, I would never have gone down that path, because I would never have got that serious about fishing if he wasn't there to sort of do it with me in those early days. But he remained an angler. He'd met a guy on site called Matt years down the line as a chippy, and Matt had got him a ticket for the lake. So I had a bit of an in, you know. I had a friend who was on the syndicate. I had this guy called Matt, who at the time I didn't know, but Scopes has said to me, "Oh, Matty will have a word. You know, Matty will put a good word in for you. He's an influential character. He's been a member for a long time." I think at this point, things had started to change a little bit. Some of the old guard within the syndicate had gone, and in 2020, they changed some rules. So the publicity ban was lifted, and in turn, I was offered a ticket. And there's a few people I need to thank for that. You know, one of them is obviously Scopes. Matt is the other, and there's another couple of guys, Whoosh and Bromley. They all put in a really good word for me. And at the time, Matt, Whoosh and Brom were very influential figures within the syndicate. You know, they were the younger generation of really keen anglers that loved the lake, and collectively, they did enough to get me a ticket. So all of a sudden, after 10 years of waiting, and a 10 years that throughout the most part of, I never really felt it would happen, all of a sudden, I've been offered the ticket. The publicity ban is gone, and actually, all of a sudden, everything just felt magical, if I'm honest. Now, as much as there was no publicity on there, I wasn't particularly bothered, and I'd kind of said to myself, they're all going to expect me to go on here, catch the carp, and start doing this, that, and the other with the captures. And I really was not interested in that. You know, my fishing is my fishing. I want to catch the carp. That is my priority. Filming and all that, whatever. I do it. Often I capture what I do when I'm fishing, but that doesn't mean I'm just going to release the footage straight away. I capture it for my own reasons, and of course, at some point down the line, as I am now, I can sit there and tell the story if the time is right. So my priority, as I say, is just catching these carp. I've waited a long time for this ticket. It is the ultimate ticket for me because it's everything I want from carp fishing, and it's on my doorstep. You know, I don't have to travel. That's a big thing when you're traveling for good fishing. It's never as good fishing as it would be if it's on your doorstep. And I'd done my fair share of traveling. I'd fished pretty much all the lakes in my local area. I'm probably I'd have been 15 years deep into my real hardcore fishing at this point. And in terms of places to fish locally, they were few and far between. So this came at a really good time, and I'll be honest, I could not wait. I couldn't believe it at the same time. We'd just come out the back of COVID, so we all know what that was like. And as we moved out of COVID, all of a sudden, I've got my dream ticket on my doorstep. So as you can imagine, I'm pretty keen to get going. It was sort of middle of May when I did my first trip. I actually dropped in behind Scopes. He was up the top end of the lake, fishing in what we call the bowl. Now, the lake itself is about 9 acres, stock of, I don't know, 60, 70 carp, something like that. Lots of big carp, but incredible carp. I might say this too many times as I tell this story, but I need to get across, and you will see, I need to get across the calibre of these fish. They are as good as you will see. They're also big, so they're ticking all the boxes. I've dropped in behind Scopes. I think he'd done the weekend or something like that. I came down for my first night. There were fish showing up in the bowl. But as I say, the lake itself is about 9 acres. And as much as this doesn't sound particularly nice, the best way to describe the lake, it looks like a cock and bollocks. That's what I always say when I describe it to someone. So you've got a long arm, and at the top you've got a bowl. But when you look at it on a map, that's how it appears. He was up in the bowl. It's deep water up there. But the swim he was in, out to the left, there is some shallow ground. And it was out there the fish were showing. He hadn't caught anything, I don't think, but I decided to go in after him. You know, there were fish showing there. I hadn't seen anything elsewhere. I did my first night in there, just got the rods out quite discreetly. I think single hook baits or bags, fished for a few hours and then put a little bit of bait in before it got dark. Did the night and it was quiet, you know, they seemed to have gone. But before I left, I sprinkled a little bit of bait in. There was a no pre-baiting rule, I'm not gonna lie, but I wasn't pre-baiting to the point where it's gonna fuck anyone up, you know. I'm talking a light scattering of bait, just something to drop back in onto at a later date, potentially, because I had to go filming. So I'd gone away filming with Jim Shelley. I came back to the lake on my way home and I fished the morning in that area. Now, it felt totally different. You know, it felt more like the end of that previous trip. So I'd done the night, there were lots of fish there when I started. When I left, it felt dead. And as I arrived back to the lake after the filming trip, it felt dead again. You know, it didn't feel like there were carp there. But I fished the morning out anyway. Like I said, I'd sprinkled a little bit of bait out there, but quite quickly I realised I needed to move. I hadn't gone down there with the intention of fishing for a particularly long time. I just had minimal bits with me, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to do a 3-nighter. Why not? I might as well just do it. Get stuck in. And I went home to get the rest of my kit, get some supplies and whatnot, food, you know the score, bait. And when I came back to the lake, I had a good look around. You know, by this point it's about 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon, something like that. And I'd gone for a scoot about, and I remember finding some fish sort of halfway down the arm along the far side. Now, the lake itself has only got swims along one bank, so they go all the way down one side of the arm, round most of the bowl but not all of it, and then the whole far margin has no swims on it. And I'd found these fish along the far side, so along the no fishing bank, swimming along some of the trees, and I'll never forget the first time I saw those fish in the water. You know, the first night I did, I'd seen them showing, but that's not the same as seeing them from within, you know, from up a tree. And I looked down upon these fish. The water clarity was good, you know, it was always very clear. The lake is always very clear. There was a bit of an algae bloom, and that would get worse as my trip went on. But I had a good look at them, you know, they weren't far out. I'm up the tree so I can see well. And I remember looking at these carp and just being blown away. It was like seeing the best carp in your lake, but all 5 of them were that, all 6 of them were that, you know. Each one of them, big or small, in its own right was just epic. And with the water clarity, you know, they looked even better. And it was at that point, like I say, I'll never forget this, but I looked down on these fish and I thought to myself, I need to catch as many of these carp as I possibly can. And you need to do all that you can to catch as many of these carp as you possibly can. They were like no other carp I'd seen before. Old school looking. I know it sounds silly, but zip linears, the lake's famed for its zip linears. They were special fish. They had that old school feel to them. And as they glided through that crystal clear water, black and red, you could just see everything about them that made them so special, but you could see it so clearly. And I thought to myself, you need to do the best job you can of catching the stock. And that's quite rare for me, you know. Most lakes I go to, certainly or have been to over the years, the aim is never to do that. The aim is to catch 1 or 2 fish, generally 1. This place, I looked at it differently. I just wanted to catch them all, and for good reason too. So I've seen these fish, Scopes is still there, I've run around, told Scopes what I've seen, and then I need to work out how to get rods out, you know. So looking across from the swim that I chose, which was coincidentally dead opposite where I'd seen the carp, you've got like a, I don't know, maybe a 50-60 yard chuck to the far margin, and then along that margin there's bushes. And I basically worked out that if I could cast across into the trees, go round, get the leads out the trees, put my waders on and whatnot, I'd be able to clip on rigs, lower my rigs down onto the spots that I'd chosen, and then release the lines, go back round, and I'm fishing. But one thing I did think at the time was that people that fish across to the far side, because it's a small lake and it's a relatively busy lake, it's never been hammered, but it's, you know, by nature being so it's only 70 odd yards wide. So these fish know about it when there's anglers there, you know. They don't really have much of an escape as such. They'll always be bumping into lines. I thought, With the line angle, anyone casting across, what you're essentially always going to have is a lead and a rod and a straight line between the two. So I thought, how can I eradicate that? So after I'd lowered the rigs in, I walked my lines back up the margin that I'd sort of stepped in on, and then along a little bit to give me a really weird line angle. But what it essentially meant was, from my rod tip, my line would go across to the far side, say 2 rod lengths down the margin from where my rig was. It would then go in very shallow water along the margin and then down onto the spot. So I'd essentially created a line angle that they would not be used to. It felt like the right thing to do. I backleaded it and whatnot, just so that the way I was fishing across was different to everyone else. And going back to my sort of early conversations with Rob, I remember him not only telling me, but showing me a picture of a load of snails. And when I saw that, I remember him saying as well, like, the lake's full of natural. It's floor to ceiling Canadian, full of life, loads of snails. And way back in the day, say 2010, I saw that photo and I thought, if I ever fish this lake, that image is going to play a big part in the way I approach it. Because straight away I just thought particles. And I know that might sound a little bit weird, but I thought, I looked at them, I looked at the snails that he had and the different colour ones, and then I just saw a particle. It resonated with me straight away. And I thought to myself, that's going to form a big part of my approach. And it did. So with that in mind, you know, I'd arrived back to the lake. I'd had these particles with me. I also brought boilies. I was using Cremino at the time. And the idea I came up with was to not just fish with these particles, but fish with quite a bit of it, you know, put quite a bit of bait in. A lot of people that fish in the edges don't do that. I fish the edges a lot, and it's really easy just to put a little sprinkle, you know. Often you're setting traps by hand. You can see the bait going, it feels a lot. But I decided I wanted to put a fair bit of bait in, nothing crazy, but just a lot, or more than most would when fishing in the edge. And over the top of that, I would put 4 whole 15mm Cremino boilies and then another 4 halves. So I had this little patch of bait, particles, and then a few slightly bigger food items, which I hoped the fish would pick out. And then over the top, I fished little 15mm sent from hell wafters. So I've got 2 rods in position. It was a bit of a muck about, and it always is. The first time I get rods out in a swim, especially this kind of swim, it's always a bit of a mess around. But once you've done it once, you get a process, and then it becomes easier and easier to repeat it as time goes on. The same with any kind of fishing. You know, you get into a rhythm, it all becomes more familiar. But I got these rods out, and I sat back that night, and I was confident. You know, I'd seen carp there. That because the lake was long and thin, or particularly in the arm, I felt like the fish were probably up and down there quite regularly. So although I'd caused disturbance, you know, wading in the water and whatnot, I felt like they would come back at some point. And as we came into the evening, like I say, I was confident. I'm looking out at my swim, and all of a sudden I've clocked my braid. Bear in mind I'm using sub braid, which sinks like a brick. It's starting to float up, and there was some sort of algae in that in the water, and it caused my braid to float. And all of a sudden my lines are up on the surface. I'm thinking, for fuck's sake. Bits of Canadian and fluff and whatnot are also then catching the lines, and before I knew it, they were sewed together. So now I'm like, we're just coming into dark. You know, I could really do without this, but I feel like I've just got to redo my rod, and I redid my left-hand rod, so I repositioned that. And then, I don't know, probably half an hour later, I've had my first bite. It was a bit of a funny bite, obviously, because of the way the line was. Like I say, I had this weird line angle, but sure enough, I'd hooked my first carp, and I played the fish in, didn't do a lot. I remember it not doing a lot. I actually caught that fish a few times, and it never really does. It does one of them ones that doesn't seem to fight, but it was just wallowing out there on the surface. I could see it was a good fish. And eventually, you know, bundled this fish into the net with a little bit of weed. Like I say, a nondescript, pretty boring fight. But that was the only part of it that was boring. I then looked down into the net, and in the net is this epic linear, zip linear, black in colour the fish was. Like the epitome of what the carp in that lake are like. I said earlier, it's famed for its linears. You know, it's got a lot of zip linears in it, but they're not your average zips. They're really not. They are special. This carp was special. And at £36, you know, it was literally the dream start. Hadn't even done a second night at this point, you know. I was just getting started, and I'd caught the kind of carp that you'd catch from another lake and it would just make your season. You know, just that one fisherman from most lakes, you'd be happy with that. The lake was renowned for being quite tricky, and it didn't surprise me, you know. It gets fished, it's small. Small lakes are always tricky, but small lakes are my favourite lakes. I love a venue where I can observe the fish, make my decisions based on what they do, what other anglers do. You know, I pay as much attention to other anglers as I do to the fish, and I do everything I can to do things differently. Even though it might be something really small, those tiny little differences on a little lake, on a little busy lake, for carp, fishing for carp that have been pressured for a number of years, you know, they're the things that make the difference. And straight away, I've thought, this is good. You know, this is a good sign.